7, 6, 5, 4.
Hi, and welcome to Conversations with Neil Andrews. I have as my guest today Mr. George Stewart. Mr. Stewart does the historical figures that you see if you go to the Museum of Ventura County. They're just wonderful figures in great detail, showing the characters, the historical characters in the costumes that they would have worn of the day when they were alive. And they're in just a tremendous amount of detail. But today we're not going to talk about the characters so much as we're going to talk about an upcoming event called Carnivale. And Mr. Stewart is a principal figure in this event because of his role and relationship to the costumery and so forth, and the characters that will be portrayed. So welcome to the show, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here again. It's, this event is going to mimic, if you will, I guess, the Renaissance period and a carnival, or carnivale in Italy, in the Renaissance. Now, tell us a little bit about the importance of the Renaissance to us, to the modern world.
Well, generalizing, everything
Sure.
I say is going to be a generalization.
Of
There's
course,
too much
of course.
detail. But generally, the Renaissance began around the 1300s. They had drifted out of the Middle Ages, feudalism and all, and it was centered in the Italian boot. It wasn't one Italy then. It was a bunch of little city-states, and including the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church there in Rome. Part of the Renaissance was triggered by economics. Stimulation from the East, China and India and so on, through the Polo brothers and all, it stimulated the desire in Europe for goods that came from the East. And that silk and all these things.
Silk and spices and things like that.
Yes, all these things that were foreign to Europe, and there was a great demand for it. So Europeans were beginning to generate these products in their homeland. Not only importing the materials, but manufacturing things. And Italy became a huge manufacturing center for fabrics, very elaborate fabrics. Well, of course, those eventually were manufactured also in France and Germany and other places, but mainly Italy. And of course, they became great trading centers. Many of these city-states had fleets, independent, like Venice and so on, and Naples and so on, had their own fleets. And these traded throughout the European world and generated a lot of economic wealth in Italy. But the city-states were rather independent. Many of them had their own armies. They were in conflict frequently, competition, all of this. But in the church itself, the church began to adjust its focus from the spiritual to toward, not away from, but toward humanism. Instead of focusing strictly on the spiritual in one's life, the focus began to drift to the human beings and what they were able to do and the wonderfulness of being human. And you see a lot of the art that had been magnificent in Roman and Greek times now re-emerging. Sculpture, painting, things that had been lost during the darker ages
before. Great
before.
revival for the arts and the sciences.
Huge, yes, and science and literature, all manner of things blossomed. And so we look toward this as a very exciting period in human history. And of course it went on until around 1600. And then of course the age of statehood for kingdoms and so on developed, and it was a new direction. But the church was the major focus in this period. But primarily,
Church,
yes, there's only one church. And of course the economic flourishing that I just mentioned in brief was the stimulus for a lot of the things of beauty and focus on human development and good life.
So this event that we have coming up now is really basically a celebration reminiscent of that.
That's a good it's a good term.
Reminiscent of that period, and the revival of the arts and so forth in that period. The focus of the events we're going to have are going to be on a family, the Borgia family. Mm-hmm. That was a very prominent ruling family of those days. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the Borgias.
Well, of course, as you know, the Borgias were Catalans. They were Spanish in origin. And the family that is most notorious was the family of Rodrigo Borgia. He came to Italy as a result of his uncle. His uncle, also, of course, Catalan, a churchman in high orders, went to Rome, took with him young Rodrigo, and Rodrigo entered the church as a priest in his teens, late teens, I think it was, and he stayed with his uncle, who was elevated to become Pope Calixtus III. Now that gave Rodrigo an enormous entree into the hierarchy of the church.
Sure.
And he spent the rest of his life elevating himself higher and higher. And he went through several papacies before he himself was able to engineer himself into the papal throne. And in doing that, of course, he becomes well known in history. He was a large, expansive man, and rather pleasant to be around. He was a nice dinner companion, but he did exert his powers in a ruthless manner, and his election was bought. But he wasn't alone. He was one of what we call the 7 bad popes. Don't ask me to name them all. I'm no good at that. But he and his predecessor and successor were certainly 3 of the so-called bad popes. These were all men of power, and all who had worked their way up in the hierarchy of the church for political reasons. It was a political business. I can't speak for their spirituality. Sometimes it's hard to define or even preserve in their careers. But certainly they had an enormous influence on the times they lived in. Alexander had lived a rather, well, you can't say a secular life because he was a cleric, eventually an archbishop and a cardinal. But he did have a common law wife with whom he had produced at least 4 children. And when he was elevated, I think it was in 1492, 91 or 92, don't hold me to the exact day, but you read a book, you'll figure it out. He brought with him from his palazzo in Rome, he had his wife Venosa let the children come and live with him in the Vatican Palace. He had Juan, the eldest, whom he adored. He thought he was the sun set in, rose set on Juan. A tall, fair-haired youth, not too bright, but we'll get to that. And his second son, Cesare, who made quite a name for himself, a rather aggressive and one of these youngsters who had to win every challenge. Very dangerous. And his daughter, what was her name again? Lucrezia.
Lucrezia, yes.
Who was much misunderstood. She was not a monster. And their youngest boy, Joffrey, who played a very tertiary role in history. But the family, of course, was aggressive in its domination of central Italy. And the goal of Pope Alexander, as he was called, Pope Alexander VI, was to enlarge the papal states, called the Romagna eventually. And his second son, Cesare, would be the one to lead the papal armies in conjunction, sad to say, with the French to achieve the goal that Alexander had in mind. But it started out with a very bloody business. Cesare was put into the church at 17 as a cardinal, of all things. And his
at the age of 17.
At the age of 17. Well, there were some younger ones, and that made him part of the Curia. Juan, the eldest son, was given the army of the papacy, which was not much of an army at that point, and all the grand designations that a man likes, military splendor and honors and this and that were heaped on him. And of course, Cesare was very envious of all of this, very bitterly envious. And young Juan, they were all youngsters. Everybody was talking about, except Rodrigo, were quite young. Juan married. He married a Spanish woman, a high-born woman. And I think they had 2 children in the process. But one day, the 2 brothers went out for the evening, and only one came home, Cesare. And Juan's body was found in the Tiber the next day. And of course, this nearly killed the Pope, his precious firstborn son, and just lived and died for him. But it undid him so that he was never quite the same after that. But he did release his second son, Cesare, from his clerical robes and position, and allowed him to be a representative of the papacy in France. France was the bogeyman of the period. They were going to march down the peninsula and take Naples. Well, this is a long history. We won't get into it. And of course, all the states of Italy were concerned. Milan above and Naples below, and the Roman state there in the middle. And Alexander was afraid of being done in by the French, so he wanted to make a pact with them. The Milanese were no help. They were inviting the French in. So he sent his son Alexander north to deal with them. He was very successful. Oh. A pact between the papacy and France was made, and in the process, Cesare was elevated to a dukedom in France and married the daughter of the King of Navarre. Complicated. That's the Basque country today, and so on. So, and from that time forward, Cesare was able to mount one campaign after another among the Italian states to subdue one after another, to submit to Rome's rule in the political sense. Of course, we were all Catholics, so it didn't matter about that part. No question there. But it's a fascinating and very, very violent history.
Well, it's interesting that we talk about these families as if they were quite evil.
Oh, no, they're not evil. They're just like today.
But they were just politicians.
Sure.
And generals.
Yes, they're doing the same thing today, buying their positions and so on.
Now, you gave a remark about Lucrezia. That she wasn't as bad as, he wasn't the monster that people said she was.
Not at all.
History says she poisoned some of her enemies and so forth and so on, that she always...
Well, poisoning was not unknown, but I've never read anything that would indicate that she, with her own hand, her own word, directed a particular murder. Now, I think of her, from what I've learned, as a victim of her father and brothers. Everybody, maybe not you're afraid, but her 2 brothers and her father were certainly attracted to her. And each one apparently managed to enjoy her favors, if you will. But she was used by her father as a political attraction in order to cement his relationship first with Milan, which didn't work. He married her to a Milanese prince, and then when they fell out with the Milan government, the Pope in Milan, he annulled that marriage and forced her to marry a Neapolitan prince. And of course, in forcing her annulment, he used the excuse for the Milanese prince was impotent. Well, the Milanese prince said, "I'm not impotent at all," and he called a press conference, we called it today, gathered in a bunch of prostitutes. They all stripped down and went at it to prove that he was anything but impotent. Well, that didn't matter to the Pope. As far as he was concerned, that marriage was annulled. And she married the Neapolitan prince, and she rather liked him. They were the same age, an attractive couple, and they got along fine. But Cesare was jealous of his sister's interest in somebody else. And he and his brother-in-law from Naples went at it until finally he had him murdered. So Cesare was very much involved, and Cesare was a murderer.
So it was Cesare that was really the villain of the piece.
Cesare has always been the villain of the piece. He was a remarkably intense, from all we know about him. As I said, he had to win a contest. He liked contests, and you better let him win.
I see.
I mean, you were not going to not win. He was going to win. You were not going to win, whatever happened, because he would do something about it if you really got the better of him. And he was a remarkable administrator if you cooperated with him. But if you didn't, all hell would break loose.
I see. Well, now, so these characters that we're talking about here, they're very colorful characters. These are going to be the characters that are central to this event, or the Carnevale event. Is that the way I understand it?
Well, because of their being well-known, because of the colorfulness of dress in that period, it isn't just the Borgias dress.
Right.
It's just the dress of the period. And because on their celebratory times they would overdress the way people do today and become more ornamental and so on, they're a good focus for the visual aspects of things.
Gotcha.
That's all that is.
All right. Well, that's important because, we're going to do another segment here in this show demonstrating some of the costumery and talking about that as well as the event itself and so forth. Now, let me change over just a little bit to your work with the historical figures. These are amongst the historical figures you've done that are in the museum. Is that correct?
We've done portraits of most of the Borgia family.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We talked before about how you got involved with that and why you do it and so forth. But let's, why do you select, how do you select, or why do you select an individual for your work?
Well, as you may remember, I was asked something about that. And when you're dealing with audiences, my manager used to say, you have to have something that the audience knows about.
Ah.
Otherwise, they're not going to listen. If it's so foreign, they've never heard of it and have they just drop out. So you have to have a focus. They know, well, of course, Lucrezia Borgia, the poisoner, which he wasn't. And so you tell about it. Well, the fun of history is telling, well, if you say the facts, a clearer and more correct version of history, not Hollywood or television. Those ghastly programs on television about the Borgias and Henry VIII and all that stuff. They touch on history here and there, but most of it's rubbish. They get it all wrong because they don't want the central female star to look funny in costume, so she goes all tarted up to look like a poopy doll today. Well, anyway, so I would choose a period that was interesting and focus on a character, but then you bring in all the other tangential characters, and that's not intended to be educational. I don't care if anybody learns anything, that's their problem. But it's interesting, and they do find it interesting when they hear about something they've never heard of, but it's allied to something they have heard of. Then it begins to work, and now you build out a program around that sort of thing.
And it's entertaining as well.
We hope so.
Yes, it is. It is. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Stewart, for being here with me today. I really appreciate it. We're going to take a few more minutes after a little break here to bring in some other people to talk about the event.
My pleasure.
Thanks a lot.